She was a mistake, the Alpha King said by dawn. He was desperate to find the Luna who had vanished. So Part 1. The Ceremony. The hall was the kind of place that makes you feel small on purpose. Stone walls, torches, a ceiling so high that the smoke got lost before it reached the top, and 300 wolves, ranked, dressed, breathing in slow unison, all facing the dais where the Alpha King stood like he'd been carved out of the mountain itself. His name was Kale. She had heard it her whole life, the way you hear thunder, as a fact, not a thing that would ever touch you personally. And then it did. Her name was Sarah. She was 24 years old, and she had survived enough to know that hope was just pain that hadn't arrived yet. She stood at the base of the dais in a gray dress she had sewn herself, and pearl earrings that had belonged to her mother, and she breathed the way her mother had taught her, slowly, from the bottom, nothing showing on the face. Nothing showing on the face. The ceremony was called the binding. The moon goddess chose, the Alpha received. That was the law older than any king. So when the priests lifted the bowl of sight and the silver light inside it poured out in 2 columns, one toward the throne, one toward Sarah, the hall went very, very quiet. 300 wolves held their breath. Sarah felt the bond snap into place the way she imagined a fishhook feels. A single precise pull, somewhere behind the sternum, and suddenly there was a thread between her and the man on the throne that had not existed a moment ago. Warm, insistent, real. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. His face did something complicated. It moved through 3 things in about 2 seconds. Recognition, something that might have been wonder if it had been allowed to grow, and then a wall coming down so fast she almost heard it. The high priest cleared his throat. The goddess has chosen. The Alpha and his fated mate stand before this court. The bond is no. That single syllable, from the throne. The priest stopped, blinked. In the history of the binding, no Alpha had ever said no. The script did not have a next line for this. Kale's voice, when he used it again, was the voice of a man explaining something very patient and very final. She was a mistake. The words landed in the hall like rocks into water. Ripples going out. Someone in the back row inhaled sharply. Someone else made a sound that might have been a protest, quickly swallowed. Sarah did not move. She touched her left earring. Small, warm, pearl, then her right, present, accounted for. 300 pairs of eyes waiting to see what she would do. She did nothing. She looked at the king for exactly 3 more seconds, enough to let him know she had heard, not enough to let him see what hearing it cost. And then she looked at the priest and said quietly, "Where are the chambers assigned to your guests?" Part 2. The East Wing. The priest, who had clearly never been in this situation in 30 years of ceremonial service, said, The East Wing. Thank you." She walked off the dais. 300 wolves parted to let her through. She did not look back. The East Wing smelled like old stone and somebody's forgotten laundry. The corridor was narrow, and the torches were far apart, and the room they put her in had a window that faced a wall. Practical. She unpacked her bag the same way she did everything, methodically, without rushing, without giving any one object more attention than it deserved. Boots aligned by the door. The 3 books she'd brought stacked spine out on the windowsill. Her mother's sewing kit on the small table beside the bed. The pearl earrings she took off and held in her palm for a moment, warm from her skin. She set them on the sill beside the books. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and let herself have exactly 60 seconds. In those 60 seconds, she felt the bond pulling north and up, toward the main hall, toward a man on a throne who had just told 300 witnesses that the thing the goddess herself had woven between them was a clerical error. She breathed through it, slowly, from the bottom. Then the 60 seconds were up and she was fine. She was always fine. She had survived worse men than this one. She had survived a father who drank his wages, and a brother who took his rage out sideways, and a pack that looked through her like she was a smudge on glass. She had survived all of that on her own 2 feet, without asking anyone to hold her up. One man's public contempt was practically a quiet afternoon by comparison. She opened her first book. She read. Day 1, she came to breakfast when summoned, sat where she was placed, ate what was served, left when the meal was done, without being dismissed, without asking permission. Nobody stopped her. Day 2, the court watched her the way you watch something you expect to do something interesting. She didn't. She ate. She left. She spent the afternoon in the library. A good one, she had to admit, 3 floors of it, natural light from above, and found a text on medicinal herbs that she hadn't read, and read it. Day 3, a woman named Lady Voss sat next to her at the morning meal and started talking, slowly and carefully, like she was testing ice. She had a sharp face and kind eyes, and she had clearly appointed herself the unofficial diplomat of this situation. She asked Sarah where she was from. Sarah told her. She asked what Sarah did with her time. Sarah told her that too. At the end of the meal, Lady Voss looked at her for a moment and said, "You're not what anyone expected." Part 3. 7 days. "No," Sarah agreed pleasantly. "People rarely are." Lady Voss smiled. Sarah did not miss the way Lady Voss's eyes flicked, involuntarily, toward the throne, toward the king who had eaten his breakfast without once looking in Sarah's direction. Not once. With such specific, deliberate intention not to look, that the not looking was itself a thing everyone in the hall could see. Sarah drank her tea and thought about the herb text. By day 4, the court had divided into 3 groups. The first group thought the whole situation was proof that the king was right to refuse. She was nobody. She was nothing. She brought no pack strength and no political alliance and no particular beauty to offer the throne. The second group thought the situation was an unforgivable insult to the goddess and would bring ruin on them all. The third group, which included Lady Voss and grew daily, just watched Sarah with a quality of attention that felt something like respect. She did not play for any of them. Day 5. A visiting merchant lord made conversation at dinner, and she was courteous and specific, and at some point she made a dry observation about the trade agreement under discussion that stopped 3 of the king's advisors mid-bite and made Lady Voss press her lips together to keep from laughing. Day 5 was also the first day Sarah noticed that the king was watching her. Not obviously, not in a way she was meant to catch. Brief glances, retracted immediately, like fingertips pulled back from a hot surface. She noticed because she noticed everything. It was a survival skill, not a special gift, and she filed it under information she had no use for and kept eating. Day 6. The bond was worse. Not better. Worse. She had expected it to dull with distance and time and the man's clear public rejection. That was not what bonds apparently did. The bond did not care about public announcements. The bond was warm and pulling and specific, and woke her at 3 in the morning like an alarm she hadn't set, and she lay in the east wing with the stones cold on either side and breathed. Bottom. Slow. Fine. Day 7, she stayed in the library until the small hours, and when she finally walked back toward the east wing with a candle in her hand, she turned a corner and walked directly into the king. They both stopped. The corridor was very narrow. The candlelight was the only light. He was not wearing his crown. That was the first thing she noticed. Without the crown he looked younger, and the thing about his face that she had been not looking at for 7 days became harder to not look at. He was built the way mountains are built, something old and specific and not made for compromise. He looked at her like a man who had been caught doing something he hadn't admitted to himself yet. She looked back at him calmly and said, "My king." That came out flatter than she intended. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, "You're up late." "I was reading." Another pause. The bond stretched warm and insistent between them, and she felt him feel it, and watched his jaw tighten. He said, "The library is for court members." She looked at him. He heard himself. She said pleasantly, "I'll keep that in mind." She stepped around him. He said, "Sarah." It was the first time he had said her name. She stopped, not because the name stopped her, but because the bond jolted at the sound of it in his voice, and she was briefly busy keeping that off her face. "What?" she said. Not a question. A flat line. She didn't turn around. He reached out and caught her wrist. Part 4. The rival. gently. 2 fingers. The smallest possible claim. The bond went absolutely electric. She looked down at his hand on her wrist. She looked back up at him. He dropped it. He started. She said, "You've made your position clear, my king. I'm simply honoring it." And she walked away, candle, corridor, stone. She did not look back. Behind her, in the dark, a man who had never in his life not known what to do, stood in a corridor, smelling her absence, and his wolf sat down in his chest and howled at something he hadn't said out loud yet. Alpha Dravan arrived on the 8th day. He came with a delegation of 12, 3 pack horses worth of diplomatic gifts, and a face that had clearly spent a very charmed life being looked at. He was Alpha of the Eastern Reaches, old pack, strong bloodline, more land than Kale's kingdom, and slightly less power, and he wanted a treaty that would even that out. He was also, Sarah noticed, the kind of man who looked at people when they spoke, not performed attention, real attention, eyes on you, actually tracking the words, actually thinking about the answer. She noticed this at dinner on the 8th day when he was seated near her, not at the head of the table, not in the power positions, just near her in the way guests sometimes ended up near nobody in particular, and he turned to her and asked what she thought of the Eastern Trade Corridor. She blinked once. He waited. So she told him what she actually thought, which was that the Eastern Trade Corridor made practical sense for wool and grain, but the proposed tariff structure would create a bottleneck at the mountain passes that would ultimately cost both sides more than the treaty saved, and perhaps a per-season levy rather than per load would— "Yes," he said, not interrupting, just landing on the word with real weight. "That's the problem exactly. I've been trying to get that across for 2 days, and I haven't found the language for it." She said, "Per-load levies penalize volume. Per-season levies incentivize consistency." Exactly. They talked for 40 minutes about grain and passes and the surprisingly complicated politics of mountain cartography, and at the end of it, Alpha Dravan set down his wine and said, "You're wasted in the East Wing." He said it quietly and without any particular edge. A simple observation. Sarah said, "Most things are wasted somewhere." He smiled at that. An honest smile, a little surprised, a little pleased. She did not look toward the head of the table. She didn't need to. She could feel exactly where Kale was by the bond, and she could feel, through the bond, something she hadn't felt from him before. Something very still, the way a large animal goes still before it decides something. She kept talking to Dravan. The next day, Dravan sought her out in the library. He brought a map. They worked through the pass problem with actual cartographic tools, and she found she liked his mind. Direct, practical, without ego about being wrong. He was pleasant company. He made her laugh once with something dry about the bureaucratic philosophy of his Eastern clerks. She wasn't attracted to him. The bond didn't allow for that particular confusion. There was only one direction the bond pulled, and it pulled north and up and toward the man she was actively ignoring. But Dravan was good company, and she was lonely in the way that 8 days of deliberate isolation makes you lonely, and she let herself enjoy it. That evening at dinner, Kale moved her placement. Without a word, without explanation, without meeting her eyes. He had a servant rearrange the seating so that she was 3 seats further from Dravan and 2 seats closer to the throne. She sat where she was put. Part 5. The Council. She didn't touch her food. Lady Voss, seated nearby, caught her eye with the expression of a woman who is watching a very slow but very inevitable collision and cannot do anything about it. Sarah picked up her fork. She was not supposed to be in the council chamber. That was clear from the way 3 advisors looked at her when she walked in. But nobody had explicitly said she couldn't be there, and she had been summoned as a court member of deeply contested status, but formally still registered as such, because no one had actually filed the paperwork to change that. And so she walked in and took a seat at the far end and opened her notebook and prepared to be a very quiet presence in the corner. Kale saw her, said nothing. The council meeting was about the treaty. It was about the tariff structure, specifically, and about 3 advisors who had strong opinions and a merchant faction that had stronger ones, and Dravon's delegation sitting patiently across the table, waiting for the host to produce a coherent counterproposal. For 40 minutes, nobody produced a coherent counterproposal. Sarah wrote things in her notebook, underlined 2 of them, put a small star next to a third. At the 50-minute mark, one of the senior advisors, a man named Aldrich who had very large eyebrows and had been giving Sarah disapproving looks since day 1, threw both hands up and said the per-load structure was non-negotiable, had always been non-negotiable, and that was the end of it. Dravon's lead negotiator sat back with the face of a man who is about to politely end a meeting he never expected to go anywhere. Sarah said, "Per season levy," not loudly, but the room was not large. Aldrich looked at her. "I beg your pardon. Per season levy instead of per load. It removes the bottleneck problem at the passes. It incentivizes consistent volume rather than punishing large shipments, and it gives both sides predictable income windows for budgeting." End quote. She closed her notebook. Dravon's delegation has been pushing for something like this for 2 days. The language you've been using has obscured the structural compatibility. Quote. The room was quiet. Dravon's lead negotiator looked at Dravon. Dravon looked at Sarah with the expression of someone suppressing a smile. Aldrich said, with the measured tone of a man whose ego was doing a great deal of invisible labor, "And who are you two?" Cale said. "Enough." Aldrich stopped. Cale looked at Sarah. She looked back. The bond was a live wire between them. She kept her face like still water. He said, "Explain the seasonal model." She did. She used simple language and 2 examples and a small diagram she sketched on the back page of her notebook and tore out. The room listened. Dravon's negotiator started taking notes. Even Aldrich stopped arguing after a while and just looked at the diagram. When she finished, Cale said, "We'll break and reconvene at the 4th hour." The room began to move. Chairs, papers, low voices. She stood to leave. Cale said, "Stay." She stayed. The room emptied. Dravon was the last to leave. He paused at the door and caught her eye and gave her a single small nod, the kind that means something without saying it, and then he was gone. Cale stood at the head of the table, with his hands flat on the surface, and looked at her. She stood at the far end with her notebook and waited. He said, "Where did you learn that?" "Books, specifically. A trade manual, and 3 years managing my PAC's resource allocation when the person assigned to it left." Part 6. The petition. Who left? My father. When he drank the PAC's winter store fund and couldn't face the paperwork. 2 loaded words and she'd already moved past them. She watched him take them in and not comment on them, and the fact that he didn't comment on them registered somewhere she hadn't expected it to. He said, "You've been sitting in the East Wing for a week." "Yes." "While we had this meeting running." "Yes." He looked at her, she looked back. The bond stretched warm between them, and she felt him push against it internally, the way you'd push against a rope tied too tight, and watch the effort fail. He said, "That's a waste." She said, "You've made your terms clear." She walked out. She was 3 corridors away before she let herself feel the shape of the thing she was working around. The thing that the corridor, and the wrist, and the way he'd said her name, and now this, the thing she was not allowing to matter. Bottom. Slow. Fine. The petition was read aloud at the evening assembly. It was Cale's voice, his words, his formal seal. The bond presented in the binding of the 9th day was anomalous, and the court petitions the Moon Council for a formal review toward possible severance. She was in the room because she hadn't been told not to be. She heard every word. She touched her left earring, warm, small, pearl, then her right. There was a thing that happened in her face. She felt it happen and could not stop it. Something that wasn't quite hurt, wasn't quite anger, was quieter and more final than either. A door clicking shut inside a house nobody was living in anymore. The click of a lock you turn when you're leaving for the last time. He was watching her. She knew he was watching. She did not look at him. She looked at the far wall. Stone. Old stone. Gray and specific, with a crack running diagonally from the second torch bracket to the window frame. She counted the stones in the crack. There were 7. 7 stones. Fine. Part 7. Dawn. When the assembly was released, she walked to the east wing. She put her books in her bag, spine out. She packed her sewing kit. She packed the small tin of medicinal herbs she'd picked up from the castle garden 3 days ago because she'd noticed they were growing badly and she'd pruned them and taken the cuttings without really thinking about it. She held both pearl earrings in her palm. She looked at them for a long time. Then she put one in her bag. She set one on the windowsill. Warm stone. Cold window. She looked at the single pearl earring sitting on the sill in the moonlight and she breathed. Bottom. Slow. And she decided something so quietly that it wasn't even a decision. It was just the next step after all the previous ones. She put on her coat. She left. He found out at dawn. Not because anyone told him. He felt it. The bond, that warm, insistent, infuriating pull, went from a rope to a thread to almost nothing at all between the dark and the first light. Not severed, just stretched so far it was barely a whisper. She was gone. He knew it the way you know weather before it arrives, before you can see it. He went to her rooms, boots aligned, books gone, the small table empty, the windowsill, one pearl earring, sitting alone on cold stone in the new light coming gray through the glass. He picked it up. Warm. How was it still warm? He stood in her empty room holding a single pearl earring, and his wolf went absolutely silent in his chest. The silence of something that has been making noise for days and suddenly has nothing left to push against. And in that silence, Cale had the experience of hearing, for the first time very clearly, a thought he had been refusing for 10 days. He had made a mistake. Not the goddess. Him. The thing he'd called an error was a woman who had walked off his dais with her back straight and her chin level, and had sat in his east wing and his library and his council chamber, and had solved a problem in 40 minutes that his advisors hadn't solved in a week, and had looked at him exactly twice with those eyes that made him feel seen in a way that he did not know how to survive. He had called her a mistake, out loud, in front of 300 people. Part 8. The Hunt. He had done that because she had scared him, and he had no language for being scared. That wasn't aggression. His father's son, his grandfather's boy. The king who did not waver, did not bend, did not show the underneath of anything. She had looked at him with those specific, steady eyes, and the bond had snapped into place, and he had felt, for the first time in his remembered life, something he could not control, and he had pointed at her and named it a mistake before it could name him. He stood in the cold east wing holding her earring and felt the full weight of that land on him. It was not comfortable. He closed his fist around the pearl. Then he went to find her. By sunrise he was at the eastern gate. By midday he had called in every scout he had, every border contact, every favor owed to the crown within 3 territories. Not as a king commanding resources, privately, without his seal, as a man who needed to know where she was. Lady Voss found him in the war room surrounded by maps. She stood in the doorway and looked at him for a moment and said, "I could have told you this would happen." He didn't look up from the maps. "Did you know she was leaving?" "No, but I knew you were building towards something." A pause. "Badly." He straightened. The earring was in his coat pocket. He had put it there because he needed both hands for the maps, and he was not ready to examine why putting it in his pocket felt like the most natural thing he'd done in 10 days. "She left one," he said. "One what?" "Earring. On the sill. She took the other one." Lady Voss was quiet for a moment. Then, "And you know what that means?" He didn't answer. He knew what it meant. He had been turning it over since dawn, the arithmetic of it. She had left half. She had taken half. She had not slammed a door. She had left it standing open from 1 inch, just enough to show him exactly where she was and exactly where he wasn't. It was the most precise thing he had ever seen done without a word. Lady Voss crossed the room and looked at the maps. She would have gone toward the Valley Pass. "She's practical. The roads are better." He looked at her. She said, evenly, "I liked her. She was the only honest person in 100 miles. He said nothing. She said, "Don't go as the king." Part 9. The Finding. He looked at her again. "Whatever you're going to say when you find her, Lady Voss said. "It needs to be yours. Not the throne, not the court, not the bond." She looked at him steadily. "She's heard enough from the throne. She deserves to hear from the man." He held that. Then he left the maps and went to the stables. 3 days. The bond didn't break. It stretched, thinner than he'd known it could go, a filament of something persistent that pulled him southeast toward the valley road, and then north along the river, and then west again toward the market towns where she'd clearly been careful not to be memorable. She was not hiding. That was the thing. She had simply left and gone somewhere, and was living there, with no particular attempt to make herself invisible. He found evidence of her in the practical way. A herbalist in a market town who had traded her a tin of something useful for a consultation on his own ailing garden. A wool merchant who had helped her calculate a travel price and had mentioned she was sharp with numbers. An innkeeper who said she was quiet and left rooms exactly as she'd found them and tipped fairly, and that was all he could tell you. Nobody had hidden her. She hadn't asked anyone to. She had just left and kept being herself somewhere else. He found her on the 3rd evening, in a town far enough from the capital that the king's seal meant nothing except that he was a man on a horse who had come a long way. She was in the town square, sitting on a low wall in the last of the afternoon light, a book open in her lap and a mug of something warm in her hand, and her dark hair loose. He hadn't seen her hair loose. It had been braided or pinned for 10 days. And she looked like a person who had been traveling for 3 days and found a quiet place to sit and was entirely at peace with the absence of everything she'd left behind. He stood at the edge of the square for a moment. She hadn't seen him. The bond, stretched to almost nothing over 3 days, snapped back to full the moment he was in her radius, and he felt it hit him like walking out of cold water into warmth, and it took him a moment to breathe normally. She looked up from her book. She looked at him across the square with those specific, level eyes that made him feel like being seen was something he should have been afraid of, and somehow wasn't. She did not run. She did not slam her book shut and stand up. She just looked at him and waited, with a quality of patience that was not passivity. It was more like the patience of someone who has already decided something and is waiting to see if the thing happening in front of them will make a difference. He crossed the square. He stood in front of her. She said, "How?" Not surprised. Just, "How?" The bond. She looked down at her book, then back up. "You're a long way from the court." "Yes." "No guard." "No." "No." She looked at his head briefly. "Crown." "No." She looked at him for a long time. He held it. He stood in front of her without his crown or his court or his 300 witnesses and let her look, and didn't move to fill the silence. She said, "You made a petition." I withdrew it. Something moved across her face. Not relief, something more complicated than relief. She said, "When?" "Dawn. The same dawn you left." A pause. Lady Voss pointed out that I had been building towards something badly, and that I should perhaps examine what I was actually afraid of. "And?" He said, "You." She looked at him. He said, "Not you specifically. The part of this where I have no control and no precedent and no idea what I'm doing, and the person it's happening with has eyes that—" He stopped, started again. "I am very good at being a king. I have been practicing since I was 9 years old. I am not good at being a person," she said. He absorbed that. Yes. The square was quiet, market day ending, stalls being packed, a dog crossing the far end with enormous ambition and no particular destination. She said, "You said it in front of 300 people. I know. You can't unsay it. I know. Those 300 people will remember. I know." He reached into his coat pocket. He held out the pearl earring on his open palm. "I found it on the sill. I brought it because I thought—" He stopped. He didn't actually know what he'd thought. He'd just put it in his pocket because it was warm, and it was hers, and it felt wrong to leave it behind. "I don't know what I thought." She looked at the pearl earring sitting on his palm. She looked at it for a long time. He said, "I am not here to ask you to forget what happened. I'm not here to ask you to come back, because the bond is inconvenient for either of us without compliance. I'm asking what it would take for you to believe I know what I've done." She said, "That's the first honest thing you've said to me." He said, "I know." She looked at the earring again. She reached out, slowly, and took it from his palm. He felt the brush of her fingers. Careful, not touching his hand, just taking what was hers, and the bond hummed warm between them at even that smallest contact. She held both earrings now, both pearls, together. She looked at them in her hand, then she put them both in her coat pocket and picked her book back up. She said, "I want a room that doesn't face a wall." He said, "Done." She said, "I want to attend council when the work is relevant." "Done. I want it known, not quietly, not through rumor, that the petition was withdrawn. And why?" He said, "I'll say it myself. At assembly, without the advisors writing it for me." She looked at him. Epilogue. He looked back. The bond was warm and pulling and specific between them, and she felt him feel it, and did not look away this time. He did not look away either. She said, "You should know, I don't forget things. I know, I will remember this for a long time. I know." He said it quietly. "I think I will too." She looked at him a moment more. Then she looked back at her book. She turned a page. He stood there in the square in the fading light and didn't leave. After a moment she moved slightly on the low wall, making room. He sat down, not close, a foot of distance, but on the same wall, in the same square, in the same fading light. And neither of them said anything else. The dog crossed back through the square with the same enormous ambition and slightly less certainty about direction. The bond sat warm between them, unsaid, unresolved, still very much a live thing. She turned another page. He did not leave. There is a thing that happens when a man learns to stop pointing at what scares him and calling it an error. It is not fast. It is not clean. It does not happen in one square on one evening. It is the work of mornings and council rooms and long meals where you sit near someone and actually listen. Of small corrections made privately that never match the size of what they're correcting. Of earning, slowly, the right to be in the same room as a person who does not need anything from you and has already proven she can live well without you. Sarah went back to the court. She got a room that faced east, toward the morning, with a window wide enough to sit in and read. She attended council and kept her notebook and made her small stars next to the things worth addressing. She and Lady Voss became the kind of friends who tell each other the truth first and soften it second if at all. She kept her pearl earrings. Both of them, every day. Cale said what he needed to say at assembly, not a worded by advisor's statement. His voice, his words. He stood in the same hall where he had called her a mistake and said, with 300 wolves listening, that the mistake had been his. It was not comfortable. He did it anyway. The bond did not solve anything. The bond was just a fact, a warm, specific fact that neither of them pretended wasn't there, and neither of them used as a shortcut through the actual work of becoming people who trusted each other. That work was slower. It was, they would both agree much later, in quiet. The point. She did not forgive him on a schedule. He did not ask her to. What happened was less dramatic than forgiveness and more durable, a slow accumulation of days in which he showed up without his armor and she showed up without her defenses, and they were, gradually, careful and specific with each other in a way that had nothing to do with thrones or courts or the things the goddess weaves between people without asking. It had to do with a man who learned to say, "I don't know what I'm doing," and mean it, and a woman who decided, not from need, not from the bond, but from the inside of her own chest where she alone had authority, that she would see what he did with that. The pearl earrings were warm every morning, both of them. She never set one on a windowsill again,